if we as the ES come out and say now we need more resources for a big cultural diplomacy or a big cultural policy, people are going to look at us and tell us you're very nice, but don't you think you have better priorities first to look at? I think that should we resign and just decide not to fight? Certainly not, otherwise I wouldn't be here.
There should be resources, or better in difficult times like these, a pooling of resources. A clear pooling of resources and being inventive for new resources using also the possibilities of the delegations. The member states are under financial pressure, some of the cultural institutes are under huge financial pressure. It's a good moment also to think about joint synergies.
If European culture is values, I do believe we have European culture. Culture was supposed to be one of the reasons why we created Europe. And today it became the last and maybe the least European element of our identity.
There is something that defines us and that makes us different from the others.
It would be good to have a structure in the European Action Service. Some kind of structure which responds to the needs, to the demands, helps to complement the efforts of the member states, helps to coordinate some efforts, which gives a face, a vis-à-vis for the civil society, which coordinates also within the different units of the Commission, because it's not true that there is nothing in place. There are many instruments in place. But the visibility and the cohesion sometimes lag behind the sheer amount of resources which are spent.
The EU for years, had it maybe done more in cultural relations, would have seen the Arab Spring coming, would have read the writers, listened to the poets, seen in the movies that it was almost an announced event. And I think that that dimension is the heart of what is happening today, needs a planned approach, and of course the EAS would be the right one because it is exposed, without trying to organize it, by respecting the autonomy of that field.
It's not so much, I think, about cultural diplomacy, even not in a modern form, but it's about cultural relations.
It's very much about bottom-up, and I think we have to open the box and let people come out with as many ideas as they can.
Where you find a self-critical approach. I don't know any other continent which would be the same here. And that's the difference, and that's why we are dealing with a European cultural policy which has to have an open attitude in view of the world and must be full of self-criticism in a world which is no longer capable of self-criticism. Europe clearly is the only place where people can speak up critically, and that's a unique cultural value. Europe clearly is the only place where people can speak up.
I think what we're talking about when we're talking about foreign policy is trying to project the European model, let's put it that way, economic, social, cultural, whatever it is, and to try to project it, its values, its principle, its commitments to the outside world, because we think it is a good system and we want to promote it. I think one of the major problems I still think that we are facing is that, first of all, maybe we have been quite often a little bit too arrogant in promoting this system. I think we have to be much more in a listening mode than what we have been before. It's about dialogue, it's about listening to what the others have to say, it's about trying to cooperate in the best way possible. And principles that we're trying to put forward. Due process of law, justice, political dialogue, tolerance, you name it, it's there. And this is very important, I think, and this is where we have to work. And in the end, this is about culture, because this is really what was and still is, in my opinion, the European spirit at its best. And this is really what we have to defend and promote.
I think, yes, this is exactly what we want. This is exactly where we should be going. And I feel the same thing about UNIC. And then my next thought is, how on earth are we going to do it?
My instinct would be to run away from the Uber, meta-European narrative and European, symbols and monuments, and because that just follows the topography and the instinct of the nation-state, which has been so reductive and created with regards to an exclusionary process with regards to the other.
There is no debate actually between, do you need a cultural policy, do you need cultural diplomacy or not? We do need it, but there is different ways of doing it.
What we're trying to do is, what we should be trying to do, is talk more about contemporary Europe, actually what's happening in Europe, how Europe operates today, because it's that Europe that people are having to engage with in Saudi Arabia or in Indonesia or in China or wherever it may be in the world. It's that Europe that they need to understand better.
Diplomats, I think, have to work on the framework to make sure, I mentioned this cultural exception, you have to make sure that you can travel as an artist, that they get a visa, that you can, that there's a distribution of movies, that there is no censorship, that the internet can be used. That's what we're discussing with the Chinese. Secondly, culture is a tool to work in diplomacy. And there I think we made a lot of mistakes in the past. Culture also gives us, and this is very important also in diplomacy, especially when you're working in an environment where you don't speak the language or not very well, you can communicate, you have non-verbal communication through the arts.
There is a certain perception of Europe as a cultural entity from the outside world.
We are caught up in a conversation which is about Europe. Whereas in actual fact, I think if you're talking about cultural diplomacy or cultural relations, you have to be trying to see it from the perspective of the people you want to engage with externally. We need to be able to think about how we go about understanding how we position ourselves, how we engage, how we converse through culture, through the creative economy in a different way. How can you have a dialogue with somebody if you can't really start to think about what collaboration looks like?
They think Europe is a sort of economic entity. Therefore, we have to become more political and we have to become more cultural, because I don't want to sell Europe as an import-export club.
If we believe that Europe has a role to play in the political domain, in the domain of sustainability, in the domain of climate control and all these things, then it would be downright crazy not to ignore the cultural dimension as part of that larger whole. And even if European culture is little more than the sum total of national cultures, it is a bloody interesting combination.
I would like to see a European university on Tahrir Square in Cairo and not just an American university. I would like to see more visas for artists and other professionals in the cultural field to come work in Europe. I would like to see more content and heritage uploaded on Europeana, Europe's digital portal for culture and heritage. I would like to see less bureaucracy for small cultural organizations when they are applying for a grant on the European level. I would also like to see less fragmentation of copyrights management in the European Union, and I would like to see less of an emphasis on the economic value of culture.
What are the values that we'd want to take outside beyond, as you said, an import-export model, essentially, of Europe? And can we identify with them, and can we share them? It is a culture which is critical, which is resistant, which is oppositional, which is above all self-critical of the conditions of Europe itself. and that allows NGOs in Egypt, NGOs in Kosovo, NGOs in Palestine, NGOs in China, NGOs in Indonesia, to, in some sense, draw strength from the idea of being different, being oppositional, representing something which is not the mainstream.
And I see the major role of the EU as an enabler in this process on top of what the member states may do.
Because you do not export culture like you export cars. You just create spaces where cultures can have encounters.
Those things don't happen unless you have networks that function.
I think which is also very important is simply actively promoting European culture, almost like a product which you promote internationally. And I think this should become much more a sort of European strategy, because the scale the world is operating in now actually is the scale of Europe or the scale of North America, the scale of China and India. It's not so much the scale of the Netherlands or Portugal or Spain or whatever country we take in Europe.